So, if you guys remember a while ago, I tier listed the killers based on their backstories. So today I'm going to be doing the same for the original DBD survivors. So any survivor that is not a part of licensed DLCs, I'm going to be looking at their backstories and putting them into a tier list based on how much I like the backstories. The only thing to mention here, which I know some of you guys called out in my killers video, is like this is going to be based on the backstories alone. I'm not going to be including all of the tome lore in this one because that's just a crazy amount of information. But someday in the future, I might look into the tome lore for the survivors and killers and see how that changes my ratings. But this will be based on the backstories alone. So let's start with Dwight. So Dwight's backstory is pretty simple, but it's kind of sad. So basically he's like a super geeky kid in high school and he really wants to be cool and popular, but it's just not working out for him. He doesn't have the charisma. He tried out for the football team, but he was cut. The basketball team wasn't even interested in him and he had bad grades. And one weekend he went on a team building exercise from his dead-end job and his boss like took them into the woods, which sounds really sketchy. And then he also gave them moonshine, which isn't he in high school? So this is illegal. But anyways, and then Dwight took a sip and then suddenly he woke up the next morning alone. So everyone had left him behind. So again, he was the laughingstock of the community. He tried to make his way out of the woods and that was the last anyone ever heard of him. So I guess he was taken by the entity. So, you know, what I like about this story though is that it's very like, there's nothing crazy going on. There's no supernatural stuff going on. I kind of like that it's so simple in a way. And it makes you really feel bad for Dwight. And you might even wonder, like, is he happier now than he was before? So it's a pretty simple story, pretty basic. I think I would have to put this somewhere in the middle. Like, it's definitely not S tier, but it's not D tier. I think I would put this Dwight story probably in B, because I feel like there are going to be other stories with way more detail and stuff like that coming up later, but I do like this story and it does make you feel really bad for him. So I feel like as long as it evokes some emotion, like in that sense, it's always a good story. And let's move on to Meg. So Meg seems to be somewhat of a feisty kid. And it says maybe it was her mom that instilled the fierce streak in her, or maybe it was her father that left them that she was a baby. So she doesn't have a dad, pretty much. She was really good at school, but she was off the rails, and an athletics coach encouraged her to channel her misspent energy on the track. So I guess she took up track as a way as an outlet, I guess, for herself. And she motivated herself into becoming a high school star, and she got a scholarship to college. But her mom got sick, so she decided to give up her chance at college to care for her mom. And then one summer's day on a long run deep in the woods, Meg vanished, and they never found her body. So I guess she was taken by the entity at this point. I don't really like this story at all because, you know, I feel like it would have been cooler if they maybe gave some more information on, I don't even know, like I feel like maybe taking care of her mom was really taking a toll on her mental health or something, so she kind of was trying to run away or something like that would have added more of like an emotional element to this story. Like, it doesn't really, at no point does it explain how Meg was feeling, and when it says like she was off the rails, like what does that even mean? Like, it doesn't say, oh, she was into, you know, dangerous activities or drugs and alcohol. Like, it just says she was off the rails. Like, what does that even mean? I don't like that one. I think I'm gonna put that in C. Like, and again, this is just based on the backstory alone. I would have to put this in C because there's really not much detail there at all. You know, I mean, I do like how her lore of being an athlete relates to her perks, like sprint bursts and adrenaline and stuff. But apart from that, you know, it's really not, it doesn't explain her very well. So it doesn't really invoke any emotion, doesn't really make you relate to her at all. So Claudette. So from the day that her parents gave Claudette her first science kit, she loved experiments. Her single-minded pursuit led to an early scholarship at a great college, and it was a huge decision for her to leave her hometown, but the chance was too good for her to pass up. Claudette is super introverted, so it seemed like she only talked to people through chat rooms and forums for social interaction, and she liked answering botany questions for others under the moniker of Science Girl. And someday, during a long bus ride back from the city, she took a stroll that would change her life. She got disoriented in the woods and she never found her way back, and her forum only started to wonder where she was a week after she stopped posting. So honestly, this is really sad because I feel like that last line about her forum only wondering about her a week later, like, makes you really think that no one really cared about her. Like, she was kind of a loner and didn't really have very many friends and stuff that cared about her. And also she was so introverted that she only talked to people through social media rather than in real life. Again, this story, like from the backstory alone, there's really not that much detail about her. It does make me feel sad for her that people didn't care that she was gone for like a week, because I feel like that's a really long time. And she seems like a nerd, which I like about her. That's pretty cute. But yeah, there's really not much details in this backstory. It doesn't really make sense, like, why the entity would take her. And there wasn't really any negative aspects to her life, you know, whereas like Dwight and Meg had some life trauma going on. Like, Claudette seems to be fairly happy. She's just an introvert. So I think with Claudette, honestly, I think the level of detail was probably about the same as Meg's, and yeah, I think I'll stick her in. Although, you know, with Meg, I didn't feel any emotional attachment to her at all, whereas Claudette, it does make you feel sad that people didn't care about her. So I think I'll put her in B along with Dwight. So next we have Jake. So Jake grew up the son of a wealthy CEO, and he had a lot of pressure on him because his brother graduated with honors from Yale. And Jake wasn't the academic type, but his dad didn't really understand why he wasn't. And he was, you know, paying for Jake's school and stuff, so he doesn't understand why Jake isn't into it. And eventually Jake rebelled by dropping out of school entirely. Now he lives off the grid on the edge of the woods. It's been years since he spoke to his father, but his mother checks in once in a while. If he lives off the grid, how does she check in once in a while? Like, does she physically have to go visit him? It was she who eventually called the police. The cops said he got lost in the woods and a search party looked for days but gave up as bad weather rolled in. And despite pleas from his mother, they never resumed the search, and he went down in history as another casualty of the woods. So, honestly, I have, like, very little sympathy for Jake based on this backstory. Like, he's not the academic type, even though, you know, he has the means to get this great education. Like, not that I think he should be forced to go to college or forced to do certain things, but like him rebelling and running off to go live in the woods and, you know, not talking to his dad and stuff. Like, I mean, that's pretty, you know, that's just a rebellious child kind of thing, but it doesn't really make you feel bad for him per se, at least not me personally. Like, it's just, I don't know. I don't like his backstory at all, so yeah, I don't know if you guys are gonna agree here, but I'm definitely gonna put him in D because I feel like his backstory makes me actively, like, not feel bad for him. Like, there's really no emotional element there. Like, it doesn't explain, you know, why he didn't like school or if he'd rather do something else. It just kind of made him seem like he doesn't want to really do anything, so he went off and lived and ran in the woods. Like, I don't know. So I'm putting him in D. Okay, Nea. Okay, so honestly, Nea seems a little bit similar to Jake, except a bit more rebellious. So she grew up in a small town and had a happy childhood, and her parents worked hard. As the opportunity to move to the US became a reality, she started acting out. She was forced to leave her friends and her life behind, and I guess she moved to the US. Nea shied away from what her parents considered normal, and she took refuge in skate parks, and her tag Mashsticks was seen more or less all over her new hometown, so I guess she was doing graffiti and stuff. She made a sport out of tagging government buildings, avoiding the fuzz and any other danger with her nimble cat-like abilities, which explains urban evasion and balanced landing and stuff, I guess. Finally, Nea's parents became used to her disappearing for days on end. She may have gone too far when her friends dared her to tag the old Crotus Pren Asylum one moonless night, as she was never seen again. Again, like, she's just a rebellious kid. She doesn't seem appreciative of what she has, because it does specifically mention that her parents worked hard and she had a happy childhood, so obviously they were working hard in part to provide for her, but instead she would just disappear for days at a time and stuff. And yeah, again, I don't really feel bad for her at all. I mean, I like that the lore ties into her chapter with like the whole Crotus Pren Asylum, and it talks about her nimble abilities, which kind of is the idea behind all of her perks. So I do like it in the sense that it ties into her lore, but I really do not feel bad for her. I'm gonna put her in probably C tier, because she is pretty much as bad as Jake when it comes to the lore, but it does tie in her perks and stuff, like I think a little bit more than, and the map and stuff. So, you know, it's a little bit better than Jake in that sense. So I'm gonna put her in C tier. So next one is David. Okay, so David was the single child of a wealthy family, and at first he seemed destined for greatness. He was growing up in Manchester, and he had a lot of potential in sports and academics, and his family had a lot of connections, so it seemed like he had a lot of opportunities available to him, and he could have succeeded at anything. But he liked fighting a lot. Like, he lived for the adrenaline rush of a good fight, and he would go out of his way to get into one. Because he was also an athlete, he ended up getting into rugby, where he excelled, and he gained a reputation as a promising, if somewhat reckless, rookie. But his rise in that field came to an abrupt end because he lost his temper and assaulted a referee, earning himself a lifetime ban from the league. And cutting short what was going to be a long, successful career. But he didn't care because money wasn't an issue, so he just retired early and decided to do other fun things, whatever that means. And his family just kept paying for his life, so he spent most of his time drinking, watching games, and getting into fights. And not many people knew that he was an occasional debt collector, in quotes, or that he fought in clandestine bare-knuckle fight clubs. When he stopped showing up at the pub, the few friends he still had were not surprised. They figured he had finally picked a fight with someone stronger than him, and in a way they were right. So, you know, this whole theme of wealthy family and like a kid that kind of takes advantage of it seems to be a common theme in DBD. I don't really know why. Nea's family wasn't really wealthy per se, but they were providing for her, and she wasn't appreciative of it. So David, you know, at least I kind of like the sense of the story that it explains why he did the things that he did. Like, it explains that he got adrenaline rushes from getting into fights, and eventually this became his downfall. Like, that's just how his personality was, and that's why he kind of went in that direction instead of, you know, going in a better direction for his life. So in terms of the explanation that the story gave, it's not that I feel bad for David or anything, but as a story, I think it's told really well for his backstory. And it also kind of, it does make you feel bad in the sense that when he didn't come to the pub anymore, like the friends that he still had weren't even surprised, nor did they really seem to care. Like they just assumed that, I guess, he got into a fight that was too much for him. So honestly, I think I would put David's story at the same level as Dwight and Claudette. Just because, though it doesn't really invoke that much emotion for me, I think it was like told really well, and you can kind of see how that would play out. Whereas for Meg, Nea, and Jake, it didn't really give much of an explanation of, why their stories went the way that it did. So I'm gonna put David in B. Feng. Okay, so Feng was a young girl and she started playing computer games and she was really into it. And her parents didn't really see anything wrong with it at first because she'd only play for like a couple of minutes. But slowly minutes turned into hours and days, and they were like, okay, you can't do this anymore. And they forced her to put more efforts into her studies instead of playing games. And she felt smothered by her parents because of this, so she left home and she started spending time in internet cafes and LAN parties where her parents' rules didn't apply, and she would spend hours playing, streaming, and competing. And she found some respect in the gaming world, and she was nicknamed the Shining Lion. And she was invited to join a esports team, and she kind of finally felt free of all the misconceptions and prejudice she had felt from her parents and people not in the gaming world. She pushed her limits to prove she was the best. Sleep was less important to her than training. She pushed herself too far, slept too little, and her performance began to slip. She started to lose, and she would stay up at night, tormented by the thought of disappointing her parents and her fans. And she eventually spiraled out of control, kind of became self-destructive, wandering the streets, visiting bars, waking up in random places that she didn't remember. And one day she woke up somewhere completely different. So I guess the entity took her. Honestly, I love this story. I don't really know why, but I feel like it's really, really well done, and it's almost like believable in a way because I know some people definitely have parents that would kind of force them to put efforts into their studies over doing, just playing games all the time. My parents were definitely that way, so I feel like I can somewhat relate to this. And also the constant need in her mind for her to impress her parents and impress her team and be the best. So I feel like this story is just so, it's really believable. I really like this one. I know it doesn't really relate to her perks, but I do love this story, honestly. I'm trying to decide between S tier and A tier. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more stories that have better descriptions than this one, I'm pretty sure, because Feng is still one of the earlier ones, and I feel like as DBD added more survivors, their backstories got longer and longer. So Feng's is probably one of the lesser descriptive ones, but I just really like it so much. I think I'm gonna go ahead and put it in S tier. I just really like this one. And I feel like maybe I am putting it too high. I'm gonna recognize that right now, but I just really like her story. I think she's my favorite backstory. So I'm putting her in S. Adam. So Adam was born in Jamaica. His father died in a car accident when he was 2, and his uncle took him in, and his uncle was a strict but fair man and raised him to value education. At Kingston College, Adam discovered his dad's published works, and he got really into literature, but his campus was super focused on athletics, and he was a super shy, nerdy teenager, so he got bullied a lot. But what he lacked in sports, he made up in grit, and he learned to defend himself in the thick of it, which already kind of makes me respect him a lot. And during college, he kind of started to imagine his life somewhere else. All his friends were into music, but he wasn't really interested in that. He wanted to get into higher education, and there was a demand for teachers abroad. So after he graduated, he taught some extra classes to afford applying fees overseas. And during this time, he had long commutes, grading piles, nightly lesson plans, early classes. So you can definitely tell that he's working really, really hard. And after a year, he applied for a position abroad, and he went to southern Japan for a new start. His Japanese was elementary at best, which slowed him down. It took him a long time to buy groceries. It was hard for him to commute. And his lesson plans relied on Japanese notions, which he also had to learn. But after a few months of working hard at this, he found his rhythm. And he was thinking about it one morning on the train, that he didn't really have to, work as hard anymore to be able to get around. Like, he was slowly picking up on it. He knew his way. He felt connected to his students and stuff. And he even had his first vacation planned. But it seems like his train crashed and flipped upside down that day, and he landed on a window pane as an unhinged door came flying at a passenger, but he rolled over so that the door would hit him instead of the girl, and he shut his eyes as he braced for impact, but nothing happened. He opened his eye and just saw darkness, and a heavy fog was taking over the train. And he kind of closed his eyes as he heard like a dark whisper. And no one truly knows what happened to Adam. The school teachers pretty much thought that he was dead because they saw the train derailment on the news. And his bag was even recovered from the crash, but his body was never found. His uncle to this day believes that Adam took off after the train crash, alive still somewhere out there, So that part is a little bit confusing to me. I don't know why his uncle would think that he just took off instead of, telling him where he is and that he's alive and stuff. But I love this story. I absolutely love this story. And in a way, this story almost makes you feel like the entity is giving Adam, a second chance, because he tried so hard during his life. He worked really hard during his life. Even though he lost his dad, he was doing everything to try to achieve his dreams. And I don't know, I just really respect Adam. And not only that, but he was willing to die to save a stranger in a brief moment. That's so crazy. He was ready to take the hit for the stranger. So on literally this is S+++ tier for me, because Adam is such, I didn't even realize how great Adam's character really is. So I'm definitely putting him in S. That almost makes me want to put Feng lower, but I really love her story. But Adam's story is so good. It's so descriptive. It really makes you see Adam as a hero kind of, and have this emotional attachment for him. So yeah, I'm definitely putting that in S. Okay, Jeff. So Jeff's story is pretty long and intense. So he was born and raised in Ormond, Alberta. He grew up as a quiet only child. He didn't like large crowds. He was pretty anxious, which was mislabeled as shyness, which he covered up with kind of a tough stoic persona to intimidate people. He was getting really into heavy metal, and he started a vinyl collection. So he started making some art of his own, inspired by the covers on his collection. And his parents were always fighting, and his artwork helped him cope with this. And in order to avoid his parents, he started working at a video store where he had a lot of free time to draw. And one of his late night regulars noticed his sketches and asked him to do some artwork for his gang at the abandoned lodge up Mount Ormond. And he accepted that, and he made a large mural depicting the Legion in runny bloody letters for his first paid commission, so he was really proud of that. After his parents divorced, he moved with his mom to Winkler, Manitoba, which was miles away from his hometown and his dad. And there he was super, super isolated except for art and music. After he graduated high school, he started working at a bar with live music. And he found a roadie gig shortly after, and he left Winkler behind. A couple of years later, he had some injury from getting into a fight during a concert. He was told he could lose part of his eyesight, so he had to stay in town for a while so his doctor could monitor him, during which time he reassessed his life choices. His eyesight slowly returned, but he had to be careful. He took some classes of oil painting and digital art, and he eventually took up a job designing labels for microbreweries. He had a quiet life. He brewed beer, took in a rescue dog, designed tattoos, and freelanced album covers for bands. And then one morning he got a phone call from Ormond saying his father had passed, leaving a few things to sort out. So he went back to Ormond for the first time in years, I guess, and he stayed in town for longer than he planned to, reminiscing. Driving by his high school, he remembered that mural he had painted for Mount Ormond. He bought a 12-pack and headed to the lodge, where I guess he disappeared. After weeks of not hearing back from Jeff, his colleagues assumed that grief had gotten the better of him. His neighbor got tired of sitting his dog, which became more and more agitated, and the dog became a stray again. I love how his neighbor just let the dog become a stray. Like, that's so messed up. Like, he should have at least taken the dog to a shelter. Like, anyways, so yeah, that's basically his story. So honestly, it does really, really make you feel bad for Jeff, because I feel like his whole life he kind of, had to deal with his parents. His parents' issues and divorce did impact his life a lot, and I feel like he was trying to find solace in a lot of different things, like art and music and stuff. And he does seem to reflect a lot on his life, so you definitely know that he's thinking about the things that he's done and if he's made the right choices or not. And obviously he was really, I think he was sad about his dad, although it doesn't explicitly say that. Like, it makes it very obvious that, he felt sad when he first moved away from his dad, and probably especially after he passed. And yeah, then he went to Ormond and disappeared, which is pretty fitting as well. So I really like this one. I think I would put his story in A tier. There's something, I don't know, that's making me not put him in S. Like, maybe it's just because we read Adam's, and Adam was such a selfless, like, hardworking person that I'm kind of struggling to put Jeff in the same tier as him. But, I'm torn between S and A. I'm just gonna put him in A, but his story is really, really good. Yui. So Yui raced scooters in her hometown, where she earned the reputation of being able to do the impossible with very little. Her father didn't agree with this, though. He tried to steer her away from what he believed to be masculine pursuits, but her grandma shared her grandfather's engineer manuals and notes on car and motorcycle engines and basically secretly supported her. Yui read her grandpa's manuals and learned fast. She modified the engine so she could compete with older boys, and she had this good luck hachimaki wrapped around her arm, and she raced local boys who were unable to keep up with her, and they tried to orchestrate her defeat and didn't have any luck because she was always way better than them, basically. When it came time to apply for school, she gathered her courage and confessed her ambition to race motorcycles to her father, but he didn't agree with her and thought she should get a regular education. So her dad basically disowned her and told her she was no longer welcome in their home. And she left for Nagoya with the blessings and savings of her grandma. So her grandma definitely supported her a lot. But Nagoya was not what Yui expected. She could only find low-grade clerical work. And with the last of the money from her grandma, she purchased a racing bike and entered illegal street races where she won more money than she had ever seen. And she soon had a lot of women motorcyclists that were fans of her, wearing her signature pink, and she had a gang following her. And eventually she realized apparently that she had a stalker, and the stalker stole her lucky handkerchief from her apartment, and she tried to complain to the police, but they basically laughed at her and said that, oh, he's probably a nice guy and you're gonna marry him in the future. Like, what the heck? And one evening she returned home to find the stalker in her apartment going through her things. She yelled for him to leave. He turned to her with a knife and lunged at her. She evaded it and she tackled him. She managed to overpower him, snatching the knife from the floor and holding it to his neck. When the police came to her apartment, they took him away and rushed her to the hospital for trauma. Her gang showed up one by one to the hospital and helped pay her medical bills. Rehab was difficult, but with the support of her gang, she was ready for the races. And her first race after the attack, the gang presented her with a new handkerchief with their signatures and good luck messages written all over it. And she vowed she would help other women with her winnings and influence. Her gang became known as the Sakura 7 Gang, and they wore pink handkerchiefs as a symbol of unity and support for women needing help from stalkers and abusers. She eventually got a sponsor and earned a spot at the All Japan Moto Championship and was the youngest woman to race and win in the event, and her sponsorship tripled as well as her gang's. But at the illegal Tokyo Kick 3000 street races, Yui was leading the race until she entered an unnatural fog that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Baffled and confused, she stopped her bike and dismounted, and it wasn't long before she realized she wasn't in Tokyo anymore. So I absolutely love this story. And maybe it's because I'm like such a, I don't know, like personally, I feel like I'm a feminist and I'm a huge supporter of women's rights, and I hate sexism and stereotypes and everything. And I feel like this literally combats all sexist stereotypes. And Yui, throughout her life, she's always trying to fight back against it and do what she loves. And a lot of women support her. And I really love how, even though she was injured and everything, she persevered and got rehab and everything. And she just had a lot of prestige, and it was all with her own hard work, and she didn't let her dad's opinion stop her from achieving her dreams. So yeah, I really love this story about her kind of going against her traditional upbringing and doing what she loves and inspiring other women to do the same. So I'm going to put her in S tier. I just really like that one. And also where it mentions in the end that she goes into the fog and she dismounts. I think that ties into the actual trailer where she gets off her bike and then she turns around and Oni is there. So I think it ties in great with the trailer. Zarina grew up in a Lebanese household in Brooklyn, and that kind of made her struggle with her cultural identities. Like, she did a lot of things to try to fit in and not get bullied. Like, she went by Karina, she dyed her hair lighter, and she would throw away her foreign lunches. And as she was growing up, she used to watch a lot of the news channel, and any reports that she heard about injustice was really interesting to her. And she kind of wanted to start producing her own stories, and when she was a teenager, she embraced her real name and her cultural background, and she started interviewing people in her community and posting it online, and she built a following through this. She even went through doing an undercover story by working for a fast food restaurant owner who was supposedly exploiting workers. And she did post clips of this happening, but somehow the news picked up her story but sympathized with the restaurant owner instead of with her. She did commit to become an independent producer and filmmaker, and her first feature film won first prize and launched her career pretty much. A couple months after this, though, there was a public surveillance video which was filming her father carrying 2 coffees at a straight corner, and some hooded man approached from behind him, shouted something at him, and pushed him into oncoming traffic. And her father actually passed away from this. And Zarina was obviously really angry and in pain about this incident, and she became obsessed with the actual murderer, whose name was Clark Stevenson. And she actually went to the Hellshire Penitentiary. She bribed the warden there to get in to interview Clark herself. And she filmed their meeting. And at first he refused to talk, but over time she used her research to push his buttons, and he did eventually confess to a premeditated crime. And she made a film out of this, which was a tribute to her father, and it got international acclaim. And after this happened, and she was kind of known in the world, some inmates contacted her about her documentary, and they told her their own stories of things that went on in the jail. And one of these stories stood out to her, and it was about the Mad Mick Massacre. And the story was that there was an Irish outlaw who had slaughtered the warden and his guards, and that's why one wing in the penitentiary is sealed off completely to this day. But she wasn't sure if the story was true or not, so she did a lot of investigation and stuff, and one day she actually went on a walking tour, and she left this walking tour and went into areas where she wasn't supposed to go, and she eventually found Mick's cell, which is that Irish outlaw. And there she found some letters traced into the wall which said "Death to Bayshore," and a brick fell out revealing a gap where she inserted her hand, and she found a wrench in there. And then she looked down and she was seeing a vision of a man laying at her feet, bleeding, with limbs contorted and his eyes dark and terrified, which were her father's eyes. And she kind of felt paralyzed, and black fog filled the cell, and she shut her eyes, and I guess the entity took her at this point. So honestly, it seems like, to me, her dad's murder kind of led her into this really intense string of investigations that she was doing, to the point where she was literally like breaking the law to try and get more information for her story. The ending is a little bit confusing to me, because I feel like it would be more fitting if she was investigating something about Clark and she started seeing these visions of her dad, but instead she was investigating like this random Irish outlaw Mad Mick story, right? Which I don't know why she was so interested in that anyways. So I don't know, I really like the details and stuff. I mean, it's definitely really well written and detailed, but I wouldn't say that's fitting of S tier. I'd probably put her in A tier along with Jeff. Felix was born in Germany into the Richter family, who had really deep connections and were among the most respected of its physicians. And his parents were in a lot of societies, and they were always traveling, like they were going to medical conferences or providing aid around the world. And traveling exposed Felix to a lot of new cultures, languages, and architecture from a very young age. And he actually really got into architecture, and by 23 years old, he was considered a prodigy, and he'd already won the Swiss Architect Medal and the German National Design Award. But he couldn't get over the fact that he felt his accomplishments had more to do with luck and connections rather than like his own talent and hard work. And he was also really socially introverted, and his dad tried to hire some specialists to improve his social skills, which is kind of funny to me, but it didn't work out. And his dad basically figured, okay, maybe later one day he will develop these social skills when he's ready. And he would build models of buildings and stuff with Felix and tell him stories. So they had a really close relationship. And Felix sometimes wondered if his design sensibilities came from his summer trips to Dyer Island, a private island which had a lot of the world's like finest homes and designs, because he would go there every summer with his parents. And there was a society there called the Imperiati, and that his parents were a part of, and they would encourage their children to network and make connections. But Felix didn't really fit very well into that, and he made a couple of other friends there who also didn't fit into this high society mold, and they were called the Pariahs, and they actually really liked this name for themselves, and they adopted it happily. And the Pariahs spent a lot of their time exploring. At some point, they came upon an abandoned internment camp where there was a lot of journals about inhumane experiments, and there was human skeletons and vials filled with serum. But before they could investigate this that much, the ground started to shake underneath them, and a fog appeared, and they couldn't tell if they were dreaming or if this was in real life. And at this time, Felix's parents, along with a whole bunch of parents of the other kids, I guess, came to their rescue, and they were using tools and objects to protect them. And then after this incident, like the pariahs were safe, but the parents actually disappeared without a trace. And this incident of their parents disappearing actually made the pariahs like bond, I guess. And they were trying to work together for years to unravel like what had happened to their parents, but eventually none of the leads got anywhere and they grew apart and started focusing on their own lives. And Felix, you know, he went on to be really successful in architecture. He kind of faked his social skills to make more connections. He made his own firm with one of his colleagues. So even though he was really well known in this field and he got a lot of recognition, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was a phony, like an actor. So he definitely had imposter syndrome. And whenever he was doubting himself, he would just go to parties and like drink a lot and stuff, which sounds pretty unlike him, but apparently that's what he did. Eventually, his girlfriend told him that he was going to be a father, and this news kind of inspired him to turn his life around. And with architecture, he kind of wanted to have a big project to challenge him and for him to focus on. And he got an opportunity from his old friends of his dad to build something new on Dyer Island, which is the island where all of the parents had gone missing originally. Within 6 months, the project was underway, and he actually went to survey the island, and he heard a voice calling out to him when he was there, and in the fog, he saw the form of his dad actually take shape, and he felt really weak, and he was actually really excited because he thought, oh, my child will know my dad now as his grandpa, and he could show his dad everything that he had accomplished. But they stared at each other, and his dad gave him a look of disappointment, turned his back on him, and proceeded to walk away, and Felix chased after him and was never seen again. Well, that was pretty intense. Like, I'm a little bit confused about why his dad walked away from him in the end. It's a really interesting story for sure. And it kind of makes, and you know what I really like about this one is that the entity part actually makes sense. Like, it's not like this guy led a totally normal life and then was randomly taken by the entity, kind of like, you know, the earlier ones like Dwight and Meg and stuff. It's like something weird already happened to his dad. Like, his dad was part of some weird society, and then his dad disappeared, and then Felix also disappears eventually. So I feel like it's more fitting, like this kind of supernatural idea of the entity fits the storyline really well. So honestly, I think I'm gonna have to put this in S tier because the level of detail and kind of how the entity fits into the story so well, like I can't overlook that when it comes to this. So I'm gonna put Felix's story in S tier because I really liked that one, and I feel like it makes a lot of sense. Yun-Jin. So Yun-Jin was into music from a young age, but when she was 10, she lost all of her instruments because her family was in debt and the creditors took everything they owned, including their house. And she kind of became her little sister's caretaker because her parents worked night and day to pay their debts. When she was in high school, this Mighty One Entertainment record label came to her school to audition talent, and she was rejected as a trainee, but she did get an unpaid internship at the studio. And over the next couple years, she actually helped to create some of their biggest hits, but she didn't really get any recognition for this, and over time, she kind of emerged in the public eye by wearing really flamboyant fashion and stuff. And she put sound bites into her songs that would loop her name, Magnum Opus, like her artist name, and people began to recognize her. Eventually, she became the producer of No Spin, which is a boy band who wasn't doing well and they needed her special touch. She found Ji-woon Huk at this point, which is Trickster, and she brought him into the band, and within like hours their first video was going viral. She became known as a really great producer, and she was going to a lot of luxurious events and stuff, and her past was like far behind her at this point. Then one day a fire happened, which is also part of Trickster's lore. And she evacuated the building and then realized that her boy band was still inside the building. But by the time that she went there, she saw that all of the members had died in the fire except for Jiwoon. And she was kind of foreseeing her career being over at this point since her band is pretty much done, but she refused to be a victim. And she started creating new tracks to relaunch Jiwoon's career kind of by himself. His song was a global phenomenon, and he actually was really, really successful, even by himself. So together they did world tours. And over time, she realized that every time that they would go on tour to a different location, there were a bunch of murders wherever they were going. Like the tour dates coincided with the victim's time of death. But this made her think that someone was after Trickster, so she increased his security detail because she thought maybe it was some crazy fan. And this kind of went on for some time. And she did suspect eventually that maybe Trickster was behind this because there was just too many coincidences. And I think the turning point for her really was one of the murder victims, like on the news, they had posted some video from her social media where she was like squealing in delight because she was getting a birthday cake, and her squeal kind of sounded familiar to Yun-Jin. Like it sounded really familiar to her, even though she'd never met this girl before. And then she realized that her voice, like she recognized her voice from Trickster's track, like opening track. Like some of the shrieks in his song sounded like the victim. So then she kind of started making this connection. But she was like, there's no way this can be real. It would ruin her career and her success. And she thought, maybe she doesn't trust in her own success and her mind is just coming up with something to take it away from her. So she kind of forgot about it for the time being and decided not to worry about it. A couple months later, there was a lot of pressure from the executives of the entertainment company, and revenue was down because Trickster's music was getting too violent and too niche, so people weren't enjoying it that much. And they were given 3 months to create and perform another hit. Months flew by, and then it came time for a private show. And during this private show, basically Trickster started killing the executives, and she was paralyzed, and she was really, really mad because she realized that she had denied her instincts and she should have known all along and suspected him and called him out all along. And she was like, I don't want my career to be over. Like she was feeling really upset that everything she had worked for was going to be taken from her. But at this point, dark coils of fog rose from the ground, and she was somewhere else, where she found herself in a spotlight and a crowd was chanting her artist name, Magnum Opus, and she smiled and welcomed the darkness within. It's kind of cool how Trickster's and Yun-Jin's stories are so closely tied together. I feel like that's very unusual for most of the backstories between killers and survivors that came out in the same chapter. So I do particularly like this one. And I also like that, it kind of explains like why she suspected Trickster but didn't really do anything, because she was afraid of losing this whole like empire, I guess, that she had built for herself. Like she was afraid to lose that because of, everything that she had experienced in her childhood. And I feel like this has a lot of explanation about why she makes the choices that she makes. And when she does finally realize for sure that he is actually a murderer, she does have like a rage for him. So it's not like she's, on his side anymore at that point. So even though the entity like takes both of them, I feel like it's for very different reasons, and they're at very different like stages in their life. So I think I'm gonna have to put her in S tier because, the level of detail and just, the explanation for everything that's happened in her story is pretty solid. Mikaela was 16 when her father passed away, and she did miss him a lot, and she almost lost herself during this time, but she was very resilient and she did overcome this dark time in her life, and she was well surrounded and supported by her friends and excited to try new things, and she discovered storytelling as an outlet, and her friends really enjoyed her horror stories, and it was kind of a form of escapism for her. And every year she did a lot of stuff for Halloween, where they would play scary games and tell horror stories and everything. And over time, she also started getting interested in witchcraft, and she would do a little bit of light blessings, plant-based spells, etc. She did some gardening and was crafting homemade skincare products like body butters and soaps and stuff like that. And she wanted to live off of that one day. And she was also working at a coffee shop, and at the coffee shop she would host an open mic night every Friday and perform her stories live. And Julian, who was her best friend and roommate, recorded some of her shows and posted them online. And one day he submitted one of her performances to the Endless Halloween Festival, where a lot of people perform on stage for Halloween. And he didn't tell her that he had done this, so it was a surprise for her when she got an email inviting her to perform at their grand final on Halloween, because the winning prize was going to be big enough for her to launch her skincare line. And over time, she was staying up all night trying to write a story that she was going to tell at this festival. But she started having recurring nightmares of being dragged into a basement and then have a hook going through her. And she kind of started doing poorly at her job, like her coffees weren't very good anymore. One day she woke up screaming, and she asked her best friend and roommate Julian to actually watch her sleep and record if there was anything unusual. And during that night, she actually started levitating in the air, and Julian freaked out and he went to call the ambulance. But it says a large spidery fang slammed through the bedroom door, and there was a lot of fog everywhere and everything. And she asked Julian to help her barricade the door, but then the power went out, and when the lights came back on, there was no sign of anything abnormal. The next day, her best friend actually disappeared, and she wasn't sure where he was. This was also close to the time of her event. So she thought, okay, maybe he will just show up there at the event and she will see him there, because she wasn't able to get a hold of him at all. And she ended up going to this Endless Halloween Festival, and she went on stage. She still didn't see her friend there at all in the crowd. And she started telling her story, and her heartbeat kind of slowed down. It started getting really dark, and a black fog engulfed her, to the audience's amazement, and no one ever saw her again. This is kind of an interesting one. I do like how detailed it is, and also the fact that her best friend went missing before she did. And I think the thing that makes this more believable with the whole entity taking her thing is the fact that she was already into witchcraft and stuff like that. So it kind of ties into this paranormal, supernatural aspect. The fact that she was into witchcraft and then was eventually taken by the entity on Halloween night as she's telling the story, which is kind of based on her real life events. So I do like that. But still, compared to some of the other stories, I feel like this one is not as good. This whole her getting into witchcraft thing, and it doesn't really explain her friend's disappearance, and it's not like her best friend is another character in DBD, so why did her friend actually disappear? It doesn't really explain that. And also her getting taken by the entity in front of this huge crowd of people at this event is also kind of crazy. I feel like everyone else kind of went missing or disappeared, and there were some unknowns about where they went, or people assumed they died or ran away. But in this one, she's clearly there on stage with a huge crowd watching her, and then the entity takes her at that moment, which I feel like is a little bit crazy. So I do like this one, but compared to some of the other stories that I've seen so far, I would definitely put it in the lower end. I think I'd put it in probably B tier. I think it could have been a little bit stronger, and at least explained her best friend's disappearance a little bit more, or have that friend as another survivor. I feel like that would make more sense. So, okay. Elodie. So Elodie was born into a lush Parisian household, which was miles away from Madagascar, which was her parents' birthplace. She wasn't very much interested in school. She was more into history, and she explored the city to discover stories, and she collected bits and pieces of Paris, making it her own. When she was 14, her parents took her to Dyer Island for a business trip, which this is where her story kind of coincides with Felix's, because her parents were also members of the Imperiati Society. And she was also a part of the pariahs that Felix was a part of, and they would go on all these unsupervised adventures to sneak out and explore the island. And then the same event happened where when they were exploring the internment camp, there was basically a bunch of, there was basically like an earthquake, and the building began to collapse, and her parents, along with other parents, like saved them. And Elodie never saw her parents again, just like the rest of the pariahs. And for years, nightmares about this incident would wake her up in the middle of the night, and her only comfort was like her grandma. Her grandma would light vanilla-scented candles and tell her stories. And even 14 years later, Elodie was still trying to figure out what happened to her parents. Like, she just could not let it go, and she was trying to figure out what happened. And she kind of got into the field of occultism, and she had actually alienated the rest of the pariahs with her crazy theories, but she didn't. She refused to give up on her parents, though. She started working with a collector who was an occult specialist who archived rare artifacts, and she went around getting relics for this person. And in turn, she got a lot of money, equipment, and information about obscure manuscripts. And one day she went to get this witch's skull, which was a part of the trial convicting a mother birthing conjoined twins in the 17th century. So this is where it ties in with the twins for this chapter release. And Elodie, acting on a hunch, she went into some catacombs to try to find the skull. And as she was exploring it, she got hit in the head by a baseball bat from someone, and she passed out. And when she came to, a man was carrying her over his shoulder, going deeper into the catacombs, and he was wearing a dark robe, the black veil. So this also ties into the twins story, where there was a bunch of hooded figures with black robes that were experimenting on the twins and stuff. So this must be a member of that society. Anyway, she had managed to elude them until now, and she'd figured out that they all work for the same group, and they perform human sacrifices for what they call the Old One. And she realized she had to get out of there fast. But while trying to run away, she actually got stabbed by a knife. And she fell to her knees, drew a circle on the ground, and traced a line in the middle. So I guess she's doing some kind of spell or witchcraft here. And she starts smelling vanilla and feeling rain, like she's in Madagascar. But even in her vision of being in Madagascar, she starts sinking into quicksand. And the last line is, she found what she had been searching for. So I think here it implies that she ended up kind of meeting like the same fate as her parents. So I guess ultimately she dedicated her whole life to like finding all these theories of what had happened to her parents. And then in her search for this, she ended up having like the same ending, but it's kind of what she always wanted, because she wanted an answer to what had happened to them. And I think it's kind of interesting because it's different than Felix in the sense that she didn't let this go. Like, she dedicated her life to finding out what happened to them. Whereas Felix kind of, you know, he tried to move past it. Like, he just kind of moved past it and did whatever his dad wanted and continued with his life from there. Whereas she was, like, so consumed by, like, what happened to them that she spent her whole life, like, researching it. And then ended up having the same thing happen to her. I do like her story. Like, it has a lot of detail to it, and I do like how it ties into the other survivor, Felix's backstory as well, even though this is a part of a different chapter. Like, I do like how they all tie together. It's kind of hard to rate this one, actually, because it's so similar to Felix's that I feel like it should be in the same tier. But I kind of felt like Felix's story was a little bit more fleshed out because it described, you know, his relationship with his parents and everything a little bit more before it got into what happened to them. Whereas with Elodie, I feel like it kind of just jumped right into her parents disappearing and then focused more on what happened with her after the fact. I think I'll put her in A tier because it's still very descriptive, and, you know, maybe the tome lore would provide more insight into this, but based on the backstory alone, I think I'll put her in A. Like, I feel like it should have done a better job of developing how strong her relationship was with her parents to kind of explain why she was so obsessed with what happened to them for the rest of her life. Okay, Jane. So Jane Romero was the daughter of a famous actress, Loretta Lawrence, of whom she had no memory. Her parents separated when she was a baby because her mom was away a lot filming. So she was raised by her dad by himself. And when she was a teenager, she kind of wanted to emulate her mom's talent. So she started getting into the acting field by doing plays and auditions for commercials and stuff. And her senior year, she did a national oratory contest and won, which attracted the attention of a radio station, and she started working there part-time. She majored in communications in college, and after she graduated, she quit her job there to work for a variety show. But her frank delivery and ad-libs were not really appreciated by the executives, and she got fired after 5 months. 4 months later, she received a phone call from a producer who had seen reruns of her show, and he wanted a co-host, and she ended up taking that. And her honest delivery really resonated with the audience, and the viewership started going up for that show. And after a couple years, she launched a segment called The Jane Romero Show, and that was broadcast nationally and covered a lot of like taboo topics. It broke records, and she had a lot of products like beauty creams and fashion accessories that were tagged with her initials, JR. But she really wanted other people to follow in her footsteps. She published a memoir about her absent mom, which was a bestseller, but critics reviewed it really harshly. And she took this to heart and started doubting herself. And one day she launched a 2-hour-long special on divorce and learned that her mom had agreed to star in the show. And when she saw her mom for the first time after all this time during the show, she started feeling really, really envious of her mom. And at some point, her mom interrupted her, saying they weren't actually related, and the interview went haywire after that. Sometime after that show, she was driving to her dad's house in New Jersey to talk things over with him. There was a lot of black ice on the highway, and as it got dark, her vision kind of began to blur, and she started getting sleepy. Then cuts to the next morning, her car was being fished out of the water, and they were never able to find her body. Her show was suspended until after her funeral, which both her parents attended. And as the public grieved for her, there was a surge of orders for all of her products, and her episodes were re-released a month later with a credit that wished her peace. So this is a really interesting story. I mean, it kind of shows her struggle with her mom leaving her life when she was a kid, but she also really respected her mom and her career, but I guess didn't really respect her mom when it came to family life. And I feel like she had this desire to be like her mom, and that was kind of difficult for her. And any setbacks like really, made her feel bad about herself. And actually seeing her mom in real life for the first time after a long time didn't go well either. So, I mean, her story is pretty fleshed out, but it's not all that great. Like, it doesn't really tie into the entity in any way or why she would be a candidate for going into DBD. I think that's the part that bothers me about her. So I'm not sure. It's kind of standard, I would have to say. Like, it doesn't really have anything particularly unique or different about her that would make her like a candidate for DBD, I guess. But I do like it. Like, it's definitely more descriptive than some of the other stories. I think I would put her in B. Like, details are pretty good, but it's nothing spectacular, and I don't really emotionally connect with her character very much, so I think B is a good place for her story. So Kate was really into music from a really early age. Like, one of her earliest memories was singing a song to her family and seeing how happy they were. She practiced guitar a lot. She performed in front of a lot of crowds, even when she was 8 years old. And she ended up in Nashville. She won a lot of folk music competitions and talent shows. She was very humble. Like, she only wanted an outlet and a way to touch people's lives. It wasn't really about winning for her. It's more for people to relate to her music and enjoy themselves. As she got older, she got a truck and she was able to travel around by herself, meeting fans and making new friends. She was always on the road and played at festivals and bars for fun. She always liked taking long walks in the woods around her hometown and finding a quiet spot to play and write her songs. And she had some particular favorite location, like a hollow encircled by trees, which I think is the place that we see in the trailer for Kate's and Clown's chapter, because she felt connected to nature and earth in this spot. So sometime when she was playing there, she started playing a dark song, which was kind of unlike her. And at this time, a bunch of spider-like legs started descending from the canopy above, grasping for her. She tried to fight them back, but she wasn't able to, and they lifted her up into the darkness, and fog rolled across the clearing, and the only thing that was left behind was her guitar. So, I mean, Kate just seems like a great person. Like, I really do like her backstory in the sense of the character development that it does for her, but I don't really understand why she would be taken by the entity. There was no reason for her to die, really. It's not like she was lost in the woods or something like Dwight, or it's not like she was trying to save someone else's life and got hit with something on a train like Adam. There was no really reason for her to die. She was just living her life, playing music, spreading joy, and then randomly she goes to one of her favorite spots and plays music and just is taken by the entity randomly. I think that's the part that makes me not like this lore as much about her. So Kate is definitely a good person, but I don't understand why she had to be taken by the entity. So in that sense, I'm gonna put her backstory in C. Ace. So Ace is a charming guy. He could pass for a movie star. His heart always belonged to the cards. He used to be a poor boy in Argentina, but he gamed, scammed, seduced, and smooth-talked his way to a life of luxury. Money always slipped through his fingers, but Ace always figured he could win more. But eventually he racked up too many debts with the wrong kind of people, and when they finally came to collect, he was nowhere to be found. No one knew where he went or what had happened to him. But anyone who knew him could agree that he would survive against all odds. Okay, I think this is easily like the worst story that I've seen. There's nothing that makes you like him. Like, he's not a likable guy. Like, he just seems very scammy and sleazy. And even when he gets money, like, he just loses it. I don't know, he just comes across as so ugh. Yeah, I'm putting him in D. And there's no reason really for the entity, like, I don't know, like, why would it save him? If I feel like he should be, like, accountable for his debts. I don't know. I'm putting him in D, which almost makes me feel bad that Jake is in there, but I'm not gonna change it now. Okay, so now the only one left is Jonah, who is not in here anymore, but I'll go online and look at his story. But just seriously, look at how long this is. Like, it goes from like a couple of sentences for Dwight to like this novel about Jonah. Like, they've definitely increased the amount of detail that they put into the backstories over time. So Jonah was pretty much always a gifted mind. Like, he understood numbers in a way that not many people could. Jonah's father strived to better his family all the time, and eventually he owned a small mangrove, which was enough to provide Jonah a stable childhood and education. So Jonah was placed in a bunch of advanced classes. It wasn't really obvious that he was as brilliant as he was, because he was a normal boy with a few friends. He was into baseball and stuff. On his 16th birthday, he received a card that had a bunch of random numbers, which was basically a puzzle to him, and he didn't know who had sent it to him. And one of the numbers he recognized as GPS coordinates. But over time, he abandoned the puzzle because he couldn't figure out what any of the other numbers meant. After he graduated college, he was hired as a code breaker by the CIA. And on his first day in his employee handbook, there were the numbers from years ago that he had gotten in his birthday card. He tried to solve it, but his years of experience didn't reveal any new information. He still couldn't solve it. He worked to decipher messages from signal stations around Europe, but the project was abruptly shut down and all the agents were transferred to other assignments. He was moved to some task force in the newly formed Democracy of Quintana, where he intercepted and decoded messages from bands of rebels, which enabled the US to target a lot of rebel locations and drop bombs, but it was discovered too late that the messages were decoys, and there was a lot of civilian casualties, which the numbers were covered up by officials, and Jonah kind of blamed himself because he firsthand saw the damage that was done. And he took a leave of absence over this. He infiltrated the rebellion's computer network, and he took stock of the numbers and made some small changes from the rebels to those who had lost their homes and loved ones. So he was kind of like, you know, trying to help here, I guess, in a way, in like a sketchy way. But one day there was a bunch of gunshots through his suite and he had to run away, and eventually he went to an American embassy. He got a call from his chief officer at the CIA saying, "Was it worth it, you over this crusade of yours?" And he felt really powerless, and he got a new assignment. While he was working on this new assignment, at some point, some of his code deciphering led him back to that code that has been haunting him for all of these years. And he checked the coordinates, and it was a Chilean graveyard. He booked a ticket there without anyone's knowledge, and he arrived there. There was nothing there but dust and bones, and he kept puzzling over these numbers. And then finally he understood that he had been analyzing the code wrong all this time, like from his own view of the world. But it could signify things for other cultures, like ancient Egyptian measurements, Persian currencies, and old calendars, and he finally understood. And he went through his knowledge of ancient civilizations and plugged in the numbers of dates, and he eventually got the numbers to reveal his birthday. And the today's date as well. And the code was about Jonah at this location at this moment. And he was like, what does this mean? And a fatigue came over him. And he basically had a bunch of nostalgic thoughts. And dark fog came over him and crows were there. Yeah, he was basically taken by the entity. Honestly, I really don't like this backstory at all. Because it goes on and on about these numbers and what they mean and all this interpretation of these numbers, and it has all the CIA stuff in between. And then eventually it comes down to the numbers being him at this date, at this time, in this location, and then he's like taken by the entity. But it, you know, it took him up to that moment to decipher what that code meant. So what was the point of him getting that code on his 16th birthday if it would take him that long to interpret it? Like, and also if he was so into ancient civilizations, like it mentioned in the beginning, like wouldn't that be one of his first thoughts? The lore doesn't, I mean, it doesn't really, I don't really like his lore at all. Like there was always this mystery of why he got this note, but I don't really understand like why he would have gotten it. Definitely not as bad as like Ace, but I don't know. I think I'm gonna put him in C. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the original survivors and their lore. So like I said, this was just based on the backstories alone, and maybe someday I'll dive deeper into the tome lore and see if that changes my tier list ratings. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye guys.